Well, if you hadn't already gathered, this is the second part of a mini-series we're doing, but as promised in the previous episode on Prague, we need a brief explanation. To be truthful, I saved it for this episode both because there was going to be a lot to get through in the Prague episode, and likely not enough in this. I've always enjoyed getting people together for weekends away, and often this is in Wales or Cornwall or just somewhere where there's good outdoors and ancient sites to visit. There's just something really special about bringing good people together, often who've never met, and having a big group all around the table. And look, big shout outs to all the friends, past and present, who've come out with us. We've made some really great memories together, and these are times that always stick with you, even if it's just a weekend. But doing this in the UK is pretty straightforward once you've hosted one or two. You get the hang of what's involved. However, I'd always thought how much more exciting it would be to pull together a group onto a flight and get further afield. Most of the journeys on this channel top out at about 4 or 5 of us, but for this journey we are rolling 12 deep and using Flixbuses to get between cities. We flew into Prague, then had a couple of nights before heading into Bratislava, then Budapest, Zagreb, and finally Ljubljana, a crescent of capital cities in Central Europe, none of which I'd yet visited on a trip that became known as the Flixbus Rampage. We were staying in hostels, and Flixbuses are invariably very cheap. The Bratislava to Budapest leg was only about $8.99 a head, so it's a pretty inexpensive way to do it. So that was the plan. However, this is where I worry we might have some aggro directed at us. We didn't have time to stay many days in each city and see everything exhaustively. There's a finite amount of time people can get off work, and it's great to see new places, but we're not rich enough to go on some months-long grand tours of spanning continents. In the case of Bratislava, we had just the one night, and once the bus journey times were accounted for, this really just left us with part of a day to see everything. So this left us a bit short, but I will say, as far as slicing up the 7 days we had, still think this was the right call. Leaving only 24 hours for Prague would have been a crime. There's so much to see there, and it's huge, whereas Bratislava is much more compact. The old town is only about a mile end to end, but we'll get to that. It was the morning of our third day. I can't lie, after a pretty early start to catch the bus, I snoozed a fair amount of the journey. Sorry to say, while certainly not unpleasant, the Czech countryside wasn't particularly riveting to watch. It was pretty much fields, trees, rinse and repeat. Pulled into Brno, but again, nothing hugely spectacular for the eyes. So after the 5 hours passed, we finally crossed the Danube, pulled into a subterranean bus station that was absolutely vast, and find ourselves outside in a pristine mall and a modern city with skyscrapers. Now, our first objective was food after a nearly 5-hour bus journey without any comfort stops, and there was a huge building labelled Food Court, which seemed like a good shout. Slight dead mall vibes inside, and the cevapcici were nothing like what the menu hoardings implied. Basically just a heap of chips. But okay, fine. Anyway, we headed to the hostel. Patio Hostel was actually pretty great. It was the only stop where the entire group of 12 was housed in the same space, and it was nice to be all together. We eventually headed out again. Sad to say, despite having pinned several coffee spots, we didn't get very far with sampling the different coffee in the city. Can confirm this macchiato from Blue Moon was very good. A nice light flavour, but not weak. As we headed through the streets of Bratislava, the sun was shining, and there were a lot of elegant Baroque buildings to enjoy. Brief gelato stop by the Hans Christian Andersen statue. A short way away, this is the Cathedral of St. Martin. This is one of the oldest and most significant churches in Bratislava. It's a church in which Hungarian kings were crowned. Yeah, not to confuse folks, but the formation of Slovakia as a nation is somewhat of a recent development. Now, I'm never sure when I'm going to have nationalists from either side jump down my throat for not using the form of words that's to their liking. And over 100 years on, there seems to be no shortage of people who want to start fights over the Treaty of Trianon. But for the normal adults in the room who've learned to emotionally regulate beyond the level of a 7-year-old, yes, of course there is a Slavic language and identity going back centuries. Bear in mind, Slovak and Slavic are essentially cognate. But for the last about 1,000 years, the territory that is now Slovakia was either part of the Hungarian kingdom or later Austria-Hungary. Hungary is not far away. It's a short distance just the other side of the Danube, so it's not that hard to understand. So yes, while there's been a church on this site for centuries, in 1311 a new cathedral was built to cater to the growing city. And yes, Hungarian kings were crowned there between 1563 and 1830. You can also see some of the historic city wall, and from there, under the motorway and up the hill, and you're at the gatehouse of the castle. The castle is easily the biggest, most notable and most iconic part of Bratislava. Not unlike Prague from the last episode, this sits on a natural rise above what in ancient times was a fording point for the river, and as such has occupation way back into the Neolithic. It was a significant Iron Age site too. In fact, it's pretty much always been a natural acropolis for whatever settlement happened below. The current castle is mostly the result of a Renaissance reworking in a more Italian style between 1552 and 1562. However, it was bombarded by Napoleon in the 1800s, and this left it a ruin for 150 odd years, only getting restored in the 20th century, hence why it looks so shiny and new. However, there is one ancient trace that's still here. It can't be much of a secret. If you spent any time on the channel, it can't have escaped your notice that we have a bias towards the ancient. It determines most of where we visit, and though modern architecture can be daring and exciting, and yeah, I know there's a lot of travel content that tries to sort of zero in exclusively on the quirky, weird, oddball things that you can find in cities, that's just never appealed. I mean, I loosely get it, but I'm not a Zooey Deschanel character. I don't need to see the Museum of Post-Soviet Rubber Ducks or the art gallery of David Bowie record sleeves partially digested by a capybara. But hey, if I'm going to not too subtly throw shade at other people's hobbies, I guess this is your chance to make fun of mine. It's a small thing, but this reconstructed floor plan marks the ruins of the Great Moravian Basilica, the oldest remains in the city from a time period of the large, if short-lived territory that incorporated what is now Slovakia, Czechia, parts of Hungary, a little southern Poland, and possibly even further out. This was under the reign of King Svatopluk I, who is memorialised in this statue out the front of the castle. It's certainly an interesting time period. When I got back and looked into it more, I was like, oh, this is going to have to be an episode someday. So I guess there isn't much to lay eyes on. It certainly makes much more sense from above. I just always find that coming into contact with the most ancient parts of a city is always exciting, even if it's just a trace. I know museum artifacts are often much more pristine, but standing physically there on the site, feeling that tangible connection to the past, that always feels good. Speaking of museums, something I feel genuinely bad about, but by the time we've got sorted out and around, it ended up being too late to get into the Archaeological Museum, which I felt particularly dumb missing. It's not huge, but it's part of a trio of museums near the river. Sad to say that while the sun had emerged for a short while, it couldn't last, and after a quick drink, the colour had all but drained from the sky. So, crossing the river over the huge Novi Most, we got to the other main attraction of Bratislava. This brutalist tower, affectionately and literally known as the UFO, contains a restaurant, which sadly was too pricey for the likes of us, but it also has a viewing platform, which is well worth a visit. The views over the city. It's perhaps unfair that Bratislava is unavoidably in comparison with Prague, where we'd just been. This is a very different place on an entirely different scale. Whereas Prague had nearly 1.4 million people over about 300 square kilometres, Bratislava is closer to 500k, though there are different estimates floating around. Also, essentially all of historic Bratislava is on the eastern side of the river. The clouds couldn't help but make it feel a bit more glum. You can see the contrast in the rooftops of the old town on the eastern bank versus the various apartment blocks and modern constructions in all other directions. Easy to say this in modern times, but wow, the decision to plough a highway through the old town was not a good one. You can see how it rather destroys its character, and for the sake of an extra half a kilometre, you didn't really need to bulldoze 4 lanes over a charming medieval town. But who am I talking to? Former Czechoslovakian town planners from 1967? A bit late now. Anyway, from there, we were pretty much ready to sit down for dinner, so we took a walk through the streets. While there's a little stuff here that's touristy, for the most part, the historical part of the city has maintained its character. This tower is at St Michael's Gate, built in the 1300s, and then through there, we were heading for a recommendation from the group. One of the challenges we had pretty much all week was finding a place that could seat 12 of us. We didn't generally encounter any aggro, which had been my concern, but there were plenty of nice places we passed that clearly wouldn't be able to accommodate a group. So this came highly recommended, and while this claim is, citation needed, it was definitely an interesting spot in a converted theatre, and always felt good to stumble on a traditional local food place. These POV shots of beer steins are a bit lame, I know, but I'm mainly trying not to spill, and I'm not going to belabor this any longer. The food was amazing. Got this share platter with pierogies and these, which are a sort of mixture of sheep's cheese and potato. It doesn't look very appetising on camera, but it was spectacular. The rest of the group were also enjoying it with a variety of dishes. This place was something of a triumph. It's also the sort of thing that is invisible to these episodes. Historic sites I can show you all day, every day, but something without much footage is a great, long, slow evening spent with good friends. And that's one of the main reasons Bratislava goes down as a very happy evening. From there, it was back to the hostel for a slightly messy evening of ill-advised karaoke. To my knowledge, no footage of my attempt at System of a Down has survived. And then early start. We had to be out of the hostel. Got a chance to see Bratislava in the morning sunshine, practically deserted at 7 a.m. in this part of town. And it was back to the subterranean bus station and back on the road. Yeah, I feel bad about this episode. To show how off my game I was, I didn't even get a low-angle flag shot. I mean, well, except this cocktail stick in the pierogies, but that does seem like we're stretching it. I feel somewhat guilty that we don't have more to see or show of Bratislava, but look, I had a group to steer and basically about 8 hours of daylight to do everything. And it also proved just plain unlucky that this was the cloudiest day of the trip, which made all my wide shots of Bratislava look rather glum. I could hear the comments. I could literally hear the comments as we got past the time when most of the coffee places had already closed and the museum had closed and the clouds were making the footage look kind of flat, and just knowing that everyone would give us a hard time for not making Bratislava pop anywhere near as much as Prague. For the purposes of video, running yourself ragged to everything you can film is basically mandatory, but in terms of taking a group around and actually giving them a good time, well, being a tyrannical stress head just makes you a loser. I fully anticipate everyone being unpleasant underneath this for not doing Bratislava or Slovakia in general justice, but the group had a good time, that much is true. A lot of the group cited it as a highlight, enjoying the more chilled atmosphere. Anyway, the single biggest reason we only had a tight window there was because we also had just the one night in Budapest. Not the original plan, we'll explain next time, but to get the greatest amount possible, we needed 2 full days to see the city. So next morning, it was back to the bus station nice and early, and back on the Flixbus to Budapest, which, as you can probably see, we had much better luck with getting good coverage. So we'll be back with more of that next episode. If you've enjoyed the music in the background of this, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can find it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support the channel, that's the place to do it. Please find us on all the socials. Ever since the recent of Switch, we're also on Bluesky, so definitely check us out there. And yeah, please leave a like and a comment on this video. Otherwise, we'll catch you very soon.